Welcome to social psychology. Today we're going over chapter 11. We're going to talk about groups and group behavior. We're going to talk about all these things. We're going to talk about the nature of groups and the goals of belonging to groups, getting things done, making accurate decisions, gaining positions of leadership. We're going to talk about those things. Of course, we won't get through everything today because as usual, we will break up the chapter into two separate lectures, two separate videos. So let's get started. Let's talk about this. So what is a group? A group is actually, technically a group is two or more people that influence each other. That's a definition. Okay. Technically, when you have two people, that's called a dyad. Usually a group is three or more, but as long as there's more than one person, it's considered a group for the purposes of this class. Now, there are collections of individuals that are not really groups, but they're kind of group-like, okay? So it could be, like a class or something like that, but collections of individuals become increasingly group-like when they, for instance, are interdependent. In other words, they rely on one another, affect each other, help each other out, work with each other, that kind of stuff. That's one thing. When they share a common identity, and when they have a group structure. Okay, there's a structure with a leadership and lower positions and, other things, other positions. Okay, a class is similar to a group, but well, it depends. Okay, is a class really interdependent? Do the students really affect each other? I guess they do, but most of the time, not that much. Do they share a common identity? Well, technically, yeah, it could be like Psych 101. But is that really a group? Well, I'm not sure that's a common identity. It's just a label for the class. Group structure, is there some structure? I suppose the instructor is the leader and the other people are, at a lower level. So it's kind of like a group, but not exactly like a group, okay? But our group has these things in common. Let's keep going. Now, when it comes to being in groups, the mere presence of others, okay, will affect behavior. Okay, so we're going to talk about the mere presence of others and something known as social facilitation, which was noticed by Norman Triplett way back in 1897. So in 1897, Norman Triplett noticed that bicycle racers always turned in better times in competition when alone. So when they're around others, they tended to pedal faster and get better times than when they were just riding on their own. The same result was found when he asked children to wind fishing reels as quickly as possible. They wind them faster when they were in the presence of other people. Even cockroaches will run faster when there's a group of cockroaches looking at them. The mere presence of other cockroaches, the mere presence of people will affect behavior. It usually will make things happen faster, according to Norman Triplett. It's not that simple. We'll talk about how it can be a little bit more complicated. But why might the mere presence of others improve our performance? Does it always improve our performance? Not always. Okay. So that's what Norman Triplett noticed. And in 1965, Robert Zajonc took that a little bit further. He proposed that the presence of others increases physiological arousal. That's what being around others does. It increases our physiological arousal. It increases heart rate, breathing, adrenaline, etc., right? And then this arousal will boost the probability of what he called dominant responses. So the presence of others will increase our physiological arousal, and this will make it so we're more likely to do certain things better or faster. If we're talking about something that's a dominant response, a dominant response is something that he called something that's familiar, something that's well learned. So something that's easy to do, that's familiar, when you're in the presence of other people, that's going to increase physiological arousal, and then you're going to do that thing better or faster. Okay, like maybe running on a treadmill. It's easy, right? Anyone can do it, right? If you're running on that treadmill by yourself, you're going to go at a certain speed. If there's other people there, let's say you're at the gym, you're likely to want to actually run on that treadmill faster. So you'll do it faster, okay? The physiological arousal leads to an increase in that behavior, a behavior that is familiar, right? That's easy to do, or something that's well learned. If it's not easy to do, it has to be something that you're good at, something that's well learned. Let's keep going. So according to Zajunk, what happens is that the presence of others will help if the task is something simple or something that's well learned, like pedaling a bike, running on a treadmill, something that's simple. When there's other people around, that increases physiological arousal, and then you'll pedal on the bike faster, you'll run on that treadmill faster, right? You'll wind a fishing reel faster, whatever it is, it increases that response. It's simple or it's well learned. But the presence of others will not help, right? It will not make things better if the task is something that's new, right? Something that you're just learning, you're not that good at, or it's complicated, like playing a difficult piece of music. In that case, the presence of other people will actually make things worse. Okay, it will make you make more mistakes, because the dominant response to something that's new is to make mistakes. So when it's something that's easy, well learned, presence of other people will increase physiological arousal, and you'll do that faster, you'll do that better. But if it's something that's new, something that's difficult, the presence of other people will increase physiological arousal, and then you'll make more mistakes. You'll have more problems. This is how it works right here. The presence of others, right? We start at the top. The presence of others will increase physiological arousal, and that will increase the dominant response, okay? And if we have a dominant response that is unmastered, something difficult, right? That's in the light blue, something that's difficult, that will lead to impaired performance. That will lead to you making more mistakes. On difficult tasks, the dominant response is the wrong response. When it's something new, something you're not good at, the physiological arousal will increase your tendency to do things that are wrong because you don't know how to do it, okay? You just haven't learned it that well, or it's complicated. But in another case, you could have the presence of others that will increase physiological arousal, and that will also increase the dominant response. But if it's something that is a mastered task, something that's easy, that will lead to improved performance, like pedaling a bike, winding a fishing reel, running on a treadmill, right? Because on well-mastered or simple tasks, the dominant response is the right task. The thing you want to do naturally is the thing that will make you do better, okay? Or make you do it faster. But something new, something complicated, well, you're going to make more mistakes. Think about it this way. There's a big game, right? Let's say NBA basketball game, right? The championship is on the line. It's the final game. It's game 7. Okay. Game is on the line, right? There are people watching in the stands and on TV. You don't notice people on TV, but let's say it's just people watching on the stands. So the presence of others will increase the physiological arousal of those players. Okay. And that will increase the dominant response. And for those who are rookies, those who are new to that kind of pressure, right? New to playing in the NBA, you know what they're going to do? They're going to choke. They're going to do badly. They're not going to play that well usually. But for those that have been in the game for a while, those that are considered the veterans, right? The experts, the star players who have been around for a while, the leader of the team, right? They will actually do better because they're used to those situations. They know how to handle that pressure. That's what Robert Zajac said about the presence of others. So yes, the presence of others, whether you're in a group or if they're just around you, it will increase physiological arousal, and that will increase the tendency to do certain things. The wrong things, if it's something you don't do very well, or to do something better if it's something that you're already good at, or something that's simple, or something that you've learned very well. Let's keep going. Crowds and deindividuation. Okay, so what is deindividuation? Deindividuation, and how does it relate to groups? Deindividuation is the process of losing one's sense of personal identity, which makes it easier to behave in ways that are inconsistent with one's normal values. De-individuation, it's basically when you lose your sense of self and even your identity sometimes, and you start behaving in ways you normally wouldn't behave. For example, anonymous children in a Halloween costume stole more candy from a candy jar. They did some experiment. Some children wore costumes where basically you can still see who they are, you can still identify them. And there was a candy jar there. And there was a sign that said, please take one candy. Okay. Other children were wearing costumes where it was difficult to identify them. Okay. So you didn't really know who they were. They were more likely to take more than what the sign said, more likely to cheat, so to speak. Now, in that case, they're by themselves. But de-individuation is something that typically happens when you're a part of a group. Like, let's say you're at a party, right? Bunch of people dancing, listening to music. Sometimes people lose themselves in that crowd, so to speak. There's so many people there, so many people dancing, partying, doing crazy things, that sometimes people will do crazy things that they normally wouldn't do just because they're in a big crowd and they feel like, no one's going to know that I'm here, or no one's going to know that it was me. There's so many people here. Why would anybody pay attention to me? So they feel like their individual identity is not important, or it's kind of lost. And that's why they may behave in ways that they normally wouldn't. And police have been known to bust some of these so-called underground parties. They're not always underground, necessarily, but they call them underground parties because they're hidden, so to speak. It could be at a factory that's closed for the weekend and somebody has the keys and they throw a party, and then hundreds or sometimes thousands of people show up to this party. Okay. And sometimes police have busted these illegal parties, and they have gone in there and they have found people in there, doing drugs, people dancing naked, people, of course, beating each other up, people making out, having sex, doing all kinds of crazy things they normally wouldn't do. Why? Because they are part of this big crowd. They feel like they cannot be identified. If the police busts in or somebody's there, why would anybody pay attention to them out of those hundreds or maybe even thousands of people in the crowd? Same thing could happen if you go to one of those New Year's parties, by the way. This is pre-COVID, of course. If you go to one of those New Year's party, big party, right? You kind of lose your sense of identity and you may behave in ways that you normally wouldn't. And it could also happen, by the way, during a protest. Ever wonder why sometimes protests often will turn violent, or looting will happen, or things like that? That's not usually a reason to just dismiss the whole protest and say that those protesters are just bad or they're protesting the wrong thing. It can happen when you're a part of a big crowd, you're protesting anything. Sometimes people feel like, hey, man, there's like thousands of people here, right? I can do whatever the hell I want, and who's going to know? Who's going to be able to pick me out of these thousands of people? So some people will actually, yes, break into stores and take things. Some people will throw rocks or will turn violent, because why is the police going to arrest them out of all those thousands of people? Why would the police or whoever it is be able to identify them? If there's a bunch of people looting, why would they pick on them and not somebody else? More likely, they're going to get somebody, but it probably won't be you. And so that's why sometimes that happens at protests. They can turn violent sometimes. Looting can start because people feel like their sense of identity, individual identity, is lost in the crowd. And sometimes they start doing things they ordinarily wouldn't do. And some people, by the way, use that as a way to kind of speak badly of the protest. And look at these people, right? Look at these people behaving like animals. Look at these crazy idiots or whatever it is, looting and stealing things and throwing things. Most protesters are not doing that. Some people will do that, because they feel de-individuated. Actually, a lot of people feel de-individuated, but sometimes people will do those kind of things because they feel that, why would anybody be able to point them out of the big crowd? And sometimes that way they lose their individual identity and they do things they normally wouldn't do. Even people who are normally nice, who ordinarily wouldn't turn violent, can do that. People who normally wouldn't do those crazy things can be found naked at a party, dancing, doing drugs, having sex. Why? They got lost in the crowd, so to speak. That happens. But just because some people, by the way, take the whole protest thing too far and get violent and start looting, doesn't mean that you just dismiss the whole protest, right? But often people will point out these things and, for their political aims. Look at these people, right? They're protesting, these bunch of animals and stuff. Like, as a way of saying, like, no, these people are out of their minds. You shouldn't believe them. No, you shouldn't give in to their demands. But that's what can happen when you have de-individuation. Let's keep going. Let's talk about group structure. Groups, if you have a group at all, groups will have a structure. There are roles in the group. There are positions. Some of those are leadership positions. Some of them are just member positions. The roles of the group are the expectations held by group members for how members in particular positions ought to behave. Your role is basically, has to do with who you are and what you're supposed to do. Like if you're part of the Psi Club and you are the secretary, you are the secretary, and your role is to take notes. And we call that the minutes, right? To take the minutes and record that, and then send that to other members afterward so that they can read it and make corrections if necessary. If you are the leader of the group, right, the president, then your role is to kind of lead the discussion, bring up things that need to be discussed, things that you need to act on, right? So yes, groups have structure and there are roles. There are different positions that have different responsibilities. A sorority president is expected to make decisions and guide discussion at weekly meetings, just like any president, like of a Psi Club or of an organization. The president or the person at the top is usually the one who holds meetings and basically brings things to be discussed and things that need to be acted on. Okay, the ones who kind of make things happen. At the top is where the decisions are made, usually. But it doesn't mean there can't be discussion. But the president is usually in charge of bringing those things to the table, so to speak, so that they can be discussed, they can be acted on. But of course, you can have different leaders, okay? There are some leaders that will just, take your input and make the decision on their own. There are other leaders, of course, that will let the group decide. And there are other leaders who won't even listen to the members and they'll just do whatever they want. But yes, groups have structure, they have roles. And there's also a hierarchy. A hierarchy means that there are different levels of leadership, different positions within the group, and some have more authority than others. There's a status hierarchy. It's a ranking of the group members by their power and influence over the members. Usually the president has a lot of influence, a lot of power, and then individual members, not as much, okay? Example here, a sorority pledge is below a regular member who is below the president. When it comes to a sorority, right, the president is kind of in charge, a lot of, that, like I said, guides discussion and is involved with a lot of decision making. And then we have a member who has some influence, right, during meetings and makes their opinion known, things like that. And then there's a sorority pledge. A sorority pledge is just someone who's trying to join the sorority. And, they are not even members and they don't have that much privilege. They don't have that much status. And sometimes they're treated very badly because of that. Okay, usually the higher up you are in the hierarchy, the more influence, the more power you have, the better you're treated. The lower you are in the group, usually the less influence you have, the worse you're treated. And yes, there's a hierarchy to our government, to our education system, to the military. Lots of groups out there. They all have a hierarchy. Groups also have a communication network. A communication network is just how the information flows, the pattern of information flow through the group, the communication network. An example would be the CEO or the head of a company. The chief executive officer is what that stands for. The CEO basically wants certain things to happen, make certain decisions, and then that information will go to the top managers, right? And then the managers will then communicate that to supervisors, and then the supervisors will then communicate that to the rank and file workers, and the workers will be the one who gets the work, who get the work done. The other people are really making decisions and having discussions, and the information flows downward. If the communication network isn't very good and there's an interruption somewhere, what the CEO wants may not happen. The CEO may communicate to the managers, and maybe the managers don't communicate very well with the supervisor. So some information is lost in the middle, and then the supervisors communicate with the workers, and the workers end up doing something that was not what was wanted because the top managers didn't do a good job of communicating with the supervisors, or maybe the supervisors didn't do a good job of communicating with the rank and file workers. But groups, this is all part of group structure. Groups have a communication network, a way in which the information flows, usually from the top to the bottom. And information can also flow from the bottom to the top, although most of the time it doesn't make it to the very top. Like, let's think about our government, let's say, right? The president of the country is the person at the top. Usually what he wants gets communicated to other people, members of the Senate, Congress, and things like that. They work on things and they try to make that happen. And then it happens, and then it ends up affecting us, right? But the other way doesn't work very well. When you as an individual member of this society, right, as a citizen of the US, want certain things to happen, you will kind of contact your representative, and then your representative, and it may not even be the representative, it might be an assistant of the representative, and then they should communicate the information to the representative, and then the representative higher up, and then eventually, hopefully it gets to the top. What happens usually is you make your voices known and stuff like that, and usually what you want doesn't go anywhere. You don't have that much authority, that much power, just because you want a certain law passed or you want something to be done. Most of the time, that's not going to happen. As a matter of fact, a study showed recently that the chances of individual citizens in the US having any influence on what laws are passed or what happens in government, the chances of that happening are actually practically zero. You as an individual member have practically no power. You might want something, probably not going to happen. Who they listen to, our government and the president, things like that, are the people with money. The corporations, the rich people, they have a much better chance of getting what they want. You, as just an individual member of society who doesn't happen to be like super wealthy, just normal, maybe you're poor, maybe you're middle class, or even upper class, right? But you're not wealthy, you're not super rich. 0% chance that what you want is actually going to happen. And that is the reality. We think we have democracy, but we have something kind of different. It doesn't work the way it should. But the communication network is the flow of information. Usually it works well when it's from the top down, from the bottom up. Usually somewhere along the way, the information stops and they don't listen to you and your voice isn't heard. Let's keep going. More about group structure. It's good if groups have a cohesiveness. Groups have a certain amount of cohesiveness. Cohesiveness has to do with the bonds among the group members. If you heard of an adhesive, that's glue. Cohesiveness are people bonding together. Glue bonds things, adhesive. Cohesive, co means together. So cohesiveness has to do with people being bonded together, okay? Where people feel that they're united, that they're one. It's good if your group has cohesiveness. The more cohesive your group is, the better they get along, the more effective they're likely to be in getting things done. If they don't get along, they don't like each other, they don't feel really bonded, you're usually not going to be very productive. And I've seen that throughout the years in the Psych Club. Sometimes we have a good group that work well together, they like each other, and they work very well. We have cohesiveness, and we get a lot of stuff done. And there are times where we've had, members in the club who just don't get along and don't like each other. And those are the times where, sometimes nothing gets done because people don't agree on anything. People don't like each other, don't even show up to the meetings or things like that. Interpersonal cohesiveness is when people enjoy each other's company. Okay, they like each other, they enjoy each other's company. That's why they're there. Okay, task cohesiveness is when people are just committed to the task or the problem or the thing that has to be done. They may not like each other, but they can still agree that this is something that has to be done and they can work together. Or they can like each other and still work together. But task cohesiveness is a separate thing. Okay, when you just believe in the thing that needs to be done and you try to get it done. Let's keep going. And that's part of, by the way, why people join groups. So now we're going to talk about the goals. Why do people join groups? One goal, one reason people join groups is to get things done. Groups help lighten the load, right? We divide the labor. That's one reason people actually join groups. You are much more likely to be able to do something as a group than as an individual. Okay? In a group, you can do things you wouldn't be able to do if you were alone. Like maybe there's a big, bulky, heavy couch. Maybe you can't move it by yourself, but maybe with another person or a couple other people, you can. It depends on how big the couch is, by the way. There are some couches that I can move them by myself, but there are some that you can't, right? Groups can build skyscrapers and buildings and factories and things like that. One person by themselves, no, they can't do that. They don't have all the skills necessary. They can't do all the things that are required. It takes a group, okay? Whether that's a company or whatever it is, right? It takes a group of people. As a group, let's say a political party, you're more likely to have your voice heard than as an individual. And that's why people join groups. That's why people say, yeah, I'm Republican or I'm Democrat or I'm independent or this or that. Groups are more powerful. They can get things done. And when you join a group also, you can divide the things that need to be done so that you don't have to work so hard. Like if you have to build a skyscraper, right? If you have to do it by yourself, that's a lot of work. If there's 200 people building it, then an individual doesn't have to do as much, doesn't have to work as hard. Okay? So groups help us lighten the load, help us divide the labor. So in groups, we can divide the labor and thereby finish a task more quickly and efficiently. Roommate A, like if you're talking about a fraternity, roommate A can like shop while roommate B cleans, and the other person, can cleans the dishes, right? Another person can cook. And that often happens in a sorority, a fraternity, or even when you just live with a group of people, especially in a fraternity and sorority, right? People have different tasks, right? Your job is to do this, your job is to clean, or you're the cook because you're good at cooking. Your job, for instance, is to do the shopping. You're really good at shopping. You know how to get good deals, right? And people have different roles and they divide everything that needs to be done to run the whole house or the fraternity or whatever it is. Usually they have a house that they run as a fraternity, a big house or something like that. But yes, you can divide the labor. You can make things more easy. Imagine building a house. If one person builds a house, it might be possible if it's a very skilled person, but that might take years. As opposed to if a group of people builds a house, they can do it in a few weeks. That's one reason we join groups, is to get things done, right? That we wouldn't be able to do on our own, or to make it easier on ourselves, to divide the labor. Now, there are bad things about a group. When people join groups, you can have a problem called social loafing. Social loafing is when people reduce their efforts when they're in a group. Sometimes when people join actually many times, almost always, when people join a group, some people in the group do not do their jobs very well. They don't work effectively. They don't try that hard. They're lazy, basically. And because of those people, the work doesn't get done, or the work isn't done as quickly or as well. That's called social loafing. Okay? It usually happens because, you join a group and now you're part of a team and it's a group effort that matters. So you as an individual may not be as identifiable, or your efforts are as identifiable. So sometimes you take it easy, right? Always happens, whether you're talking about a group in class, right? Teacher assigns group work. Sometimes there's one person who won't pull their own weight, who won't do what they're supposed to do and drag down the whole group. Or even in a business, an organization, when people join groups, and their efforts are not directly identifiable because it's a group effort, some of them just won't do very much. And that's called social loafing. They'll just sit there and pretend to work and earn a paycheck, for instance, if you're just talking about work. That's a very bad thing about groups, but there are ways to improve that. Social loafing can be reduced by making personal efforts identifiable. So if you're in a group, right, it's not just the group project that matters, but everyone has a role and everyone's responsible for a certain thing. And if one thing doesn't get done, you can easily identify what that thing is and who was responsible. So then that person can be punished or blamed or made to feel bad, right? If they don't do their role. So if everyone has a very, very identifiable task, right, that they have a very specific thing that they have to do, and it's very obvious if that thing doesn't get done, then people are less likely to loaf. Then if you have a group where people are just helping each other, and maybe there's 4 people, 5 people doing the same thing, helping each other, one of them can reduce their efforts without it being that noticeable. And you may not even know who it is that's not working hard. You can also make the task more meaningful and important. If the task that is being worked on is something that really matters, something that's very important, there's less likely to be loafing, less likely that people are going to be lazy and not pull their own weight. You can also make it clear that personal efforts will lead to a better group performance. You can stress, right, that every individual has to work hard for this to get done, right? Everyone is a link in the chain, so to speak, right? If there's one weak link in the chain, that's enough to ruin the whole project. And that is the case, like, for instance, when you're going to make a building or a car or whatever it is, if somebody isn't doing their job or isn't doing it well, that house will have defects or that car will have defects. I need to stress things like that, right? That if you don't do your job well, then the whole project is affected. And we will not be able to sell those cars because of this one problem. We will not be able to sell that car. And therefore, we will fail as a business, okay? Yes, there are laws that cars have to meet certain conditions. They have to be safe and you have to be reliable and things like that. And if somebody doesn't do their job, there could be a big problem, or even a little problem can make the whole process grind to a halt, right? Make it clear that personal efforts are important for the whole group. Increase interpersonal cohesiveness. Another thing you can do is just, make it so that people like each other. How can you make people like each other a little bit more? You can throw a little, office party every now and then, or there could be a little retreat, right? Make it so that people get to know each other and they get along with each other and they like each other, okay? You can recruit members with collectivist orientations. People who come from collectivist cultures, people who are Asian especially, are more likely to work hard, right? And more likely to believe in the group because they come from that kind of culture, right? More group oriented, more family oriented, as opposed to individualistic societies like the US, where it's me, me, me. And if it's me, 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 that means I don't have to work as hard because there's other people here, right? But if you believe in the group where you're just a part of it and the group matters more than you as an individual, you're more collectivist, you're less likely to loaf. That's especially the case with people who come from Asian cultures. They're more likely to pull their own weight, as opposed to, people from other cultures. Yes, Americans, have been often criticized for not working hard enough or for being lazy, not just by people who are outside of the US, by, like, for instance, the Japanese or the Chinese or other people, but even by Americans themselves have said that basically Americans don't always work that hard because we're more individualistic. And when we're a part of a group, some of us slack off because we know we can, and often we cannot be identified. And we'll just sit there and collect a paycheck. Here's something important: cultural diversity and group performance. This leads us to cultural diversity. Yes, people do differ in culture, where they come from collectivist or individualistic cultures, by ethnicity, that kind of stuff, right? And with some kind of, there are some kind of tasks where diverse groups are better than having a group that's more homogeneous, where everybody's kind of the same. Culturally diverse groups can perform better on tasks where different cultural backgrounds can help. like generating ideas to help with tourism, right? Tourism is basically people are going to be coming from other countries to visit your country, let's say. If you have a job where you need to generate ideas of how to increase tourism, right? Or if you have a group whose job that is, it's a good idea that that group be diverse. Different people, different opinions, different approaches, right? You're more likely to think of better things and more ideas than if everybody is kind of has a similar background, similar religion and culture. They're more likely to think about the same things, and they're not going to be as many. Cultural diversity actually is important for so many things, okay? It's just that in the past, it wasn't seen as so important for just about everything. For running a business, right? You want to make sure your product is popular, not just with certain kinds of people, but with all sorts of people. It's a very good idea to have a diverse group that can tell you how to market that product to different types of people. Okay. Or if you're going to make a commercial, right? How can you make sure your commercial isn't sexist or racist or things like that? You'd be surprised how often in the past businesses, corporations have come up with commercials and then people complain. It's like, oh my God, that's so sexist. That's so awful. Or that's so racist. We're more likely to see that when we look in the past, right? Look at the commercials or the ads the companies would put out in the 50s and 60s. Those ads were so incredibly sexist. It's incredible that they even did that. Why did they do that? You know why? Because there were just a bunch of men making the decisions. And men tend to think a certain way. If you have more women on your team, you're less likely to put out something sexist. Or if you have people of color on your team, you're less likely to put out something racist. And the more we go back in time, the more it was just white men making decisions, making products, commercials, running the government or whatever it is. And when you have that, there's more sexism, more racism. The further back in time you go, the more you have of that, and the worse things were. Because it was just people making decisions for people like them. And you need diversity, right? So you can have an approach that works for everyone. And not just things that are to the benefit of some. Cultural diversity is a very important thing. There are sometimes problems with culturally diverse groups. When you have a culturally diverse groups, sometimes intergroup prejudice can lead to communication problems and slow cohesion, at least at first. When you have a group that's culturally diverse, sometimes people may not like each other at the beginning, may not trust each other, they may be prejudiced, and that can kind of slow things down at the beginning. So there are some downsides, okay? But over time, that will get better. As you'll see in this study that was done, actually this experiment. So here's this research. In one study, researchers created 4 and 5 member teams to solve problems in an upper level management course. So researchers put together these teams to solve some problem. It doesn't matter what the problem is. Okay, it doesn't matter if it's an upper management course, right? Teams had to solve some problem. And the teams were either homogeneous, that means that they were all the same. It's all basically white people, okay, in this example, all right? Or they were ethnically diverse. You had white people, black people, Latinos, right? Diverse, Asian. And this is what they found as far as how well people did on the task. So task 1, right? So the first task they did, task 1, week 1, at first, performance was worse in ethnically diverse groups. At the beginning, the groups that were more or less made of the same kinds of people, they did better. The groups that were more diverse didn't do as well, probably because they didn't trust each other very much. They didn't really know how to work with each other, how to communicate that effectively. That's what you had at week 1, okay? But as time went by, right, you got to task 2, week 9, week 13, week 17, by the end of the semester. By the end of the semester, what they found is that the diverse groups were performing as well as those groups that were homogeneous, if not better. Over time, diverse groups get better. They learn to like each other and work with each other, and then they do better. And overall, like I've said, like I've argued, you come out with a better product, right? You're less likely to have a product, a commercial, for instance, that is sexist, racist, insensitive to a certain group. If you have a diverse group, you're less likely to pass racist laws if you have diversity in government. Why do you think there's so many racist laws in the past and racist laws still exist? Because for the most part, it has just been a bunch of rich white people making the rules and becoming president and getting elected to Congress and the Senate. And they mostly benefit people like themselves. And often they are unaware of how other people who are different, who are not like them, are affected in a negative way by the laws that they've passed. It's important to have diversity. Yes, at the Supreme Court. Yes, in the Senate, in Congress, in an organization, in a business, everywhere. And I'll tell you this straight out. There is no excuse for not having diversity anymore. There are qualified people for any job, any government position, any position within a business, within education, within healthcare. There is absolutely no excuse for a lack of diversity. If it exists, it is due to discrimination and racism and prejudice. And not only that, I'll go as far as to tell you that there needs to be diversity even at the highest levels. Presidents, leaders, CEO, diversity of all kinds. Ethnic diversity, right? People of different ethnicity, okay? People of different sex, okay? Males, females, transgender people, that's, gender identity, right? There needs to be diversity at the highest levels. And when you have diversity, things work better. You're less likely to come up with things that are very biased, racist, sexist. And that's the way it was in the past, because there was no diversity whatsoever. And there's still very little diversity at the highest levels. You'll find more diversity now at the lower levels among the workers and things like that. But the higher up you go, the less you find. Yes, there's diversity at the college. There's a lot of diversity among the students. There's diversity also among the faculty. There's Black people, Asian, white people, Latinos, right? The higher up you go, the less diversity you find. When it comes to the presidents, the managers, stuff like that, supervisors, vice presidents, they usually tend to be white males. Females also every now and then, but for the most part, white. And that's what you find in government, in business, everywhere. The higher you go, the less diversity there is. And there needs to be diversity at the highest levels if you want society, business, or whatever to work well. It's just better. And by the way, that's what our president right now is trying to do. He is basically setting records as far as the levels of diversity within his cabinet, the people he's appointed for secretary of this or that, men, women, people of color, even transgender people he's appointing. That's a good thing, not a bad thing. That's what we need to do. And when diversity is represented at all levels, that's when we'll live in a more just society. Okay, and this is a lesson about that, about how, yes, over time, yes, we will work as effectively, if not better, than groups where there is no diversity. As a matter of fact, when it comes to just doing things that are just better for everybody, it's better to have a diverse groups. That group of all white males is not going to be as good at being able to figure out that, hey, that's racist, that's sexist, right? Whatever it is, right? You need more diversity, you need different opinions. You need outsiders, right? To really let you know what that looks like to them. You need that, okay? But I think I've said enough about that. Let's keep going. And how are we doing on time? Because I haven't looked at the time in a while. Let me make sure I'm not, I'm doing fine, okay. Another reason why people join groups is to make accurate decisions, right? Because they need to know things. Groups provide knowledge. That's another reason people join groups, because in groups, you can get knowledge. You can find out things, right? By joining a class, joining the psych club, or joining this organization or that organization. They will often provide you with knowledge of things that you otherwise wouldn't get. People facing lifelong illnesses may seek a support group for information. No matter what you suffer from, there's probably a support group for it. If you join the support group, you will learn things about how to cope, or about medication or approaches. Information is one of the valuable things you get from a group. An example, alcoholics stopped attending support meetings when the group stopped supplying information. They've done experiments where they've set up a support group, and when they provide information, more people join, right? People continue to attend. And when they stop doing that, when it doesn't provide good information anymore, people stop showing up. So one important thing we get from groups is knowledge. More about making accurate decisions. Group polarization is a bad thing. Okay. When it comes to making decisions, right, it's good to have discussion, right, to make good decisions. But sometimes you can get what's called group polarization. Group polarization is when basically the group moves in a certain direction and is likely to make a very biased, very bad decision. Group polarization is when group discussion leads members to make decisions that are more extreme on one side than the other, right? More extreme than the group probably would have favored had there been more discussion. Group polarization is basically when the group usually makes a very extreme or biased decision. It becomes very one-sided, their decision. And we're going to talk about why that happens, okay, in a moment. It has to do with groupthink as well. But group polarization, that's what happens. Have you noticed that our political parties are becoming more polarized? That the Democratic Party is becoming more progressive, more liberal, and the Republicans are becoming more conservative, right? And they're moving further away from each other. They're becoming polarized to the extent that they have very little in common anymore. And they can't stand each other and can't work with each other. Why is that happening? Because each group is hearing information that leads them in a certain direction and not getting a lot of that other discussion. And that's what happens when you don't hear so much about the other side's arguments. Okay, it leads to group polarization. And more about this. Why does this happen? Okay, so here's the thing. Why can groups become polarized after a discussion? Why can they become extreme in their decision making or go more toward one side than the other? One reason is because of persuasive arguments. When there's even a slight bias in one direction, you'll hear more favorable arguments on one side. There's something that needs to be discussed, and some people start bringing up certain arguments that favor a certain position, and then people start hearing that and they start saying, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. I agree with that. And then what happens is that the group moves in a certain direction, and the people who would probably had a different opinion or would have spoken up, when they see that more people are favoring that position, they'll keep their mouth shut. Usually they're less likely to speak out. So one side is heard more than the other. And that's what happens, by the way, when you grow up in different households. If you grow up in a Republican household, guess what? You're going to hear things that are in favor of Republicans. And you're more likely to be a Republican because that's what you hear. You hear things in favor of Republicans. When you grow up in a more Democratic household, you're more likely to hear things that favor Democrats, and you're more likely to move in that direction. It all depends on what you hear, what kind of information you're exposed to. If you're only exposed to a certain kind of information, you're going to move in a certain direction. Okay? Social comparison as well. When members realize that the group is leaning in a certain direction, they may seek acceptance by moving further into that direction. As it becomes clear what the group is beginning to favor, then people start falling in line and start conforming. And they start agreeing with that position. And they start shushing basically people who disagree or not listening to them. And that's what's been happening, by the way, with the Republican Party. Donald Trump has taken over that party. Even though he's not president anymore, he's taken over the party. And there have been tests of loyalty. There are people who have spoken out against him. There are people who have voted contrary to what he likes. What is happening to those people? They are being punished. They're being censured. They're saying that they're going to have a primary for those people. They're going to basically support someone else to get those people out of office. And that's what is happening, right? The Trump base has taken control. And they are starting to get rid of the people who don't disagree, or at least to get them to be quiet, or weaken those people. A lot of retirements have been announced. The people who are retiring, a lot of them, it's because they don't like the way the party's going. And rather than try to fix it, rather than trying to influence it, they're just leaving. And as all that happens, as you punish members, as you shush members, as you just kick people out of office or people retire, the group moves in a certain direction. And it is moving and has moved in the direction of Trump. Trump is the leader of that party. He controls it. And what he says happens. We'll see whether he wins the next election, or whether he even runs. But he's like the boss now of that party. He's taken control. And to tell you the truth, just to give you my opinion, I think he's going to ruin the party. It's a very bad thing when one person becomes like a dictator and just controls everything, whether it's a party or a country. But that's what happens. That's what leads to group polarization. Guys, we'll stop there. We're a little bit beyond halfway. Let me see what's next. Yeah, we'll stop there. And we'll pick this up again next time so we can have some time for discussion. Okay, I'll stop recording now.